Welcome. My name is Shawna Ferris. I work in Women's and Gender Studies here at the University of Manitoba. And on behalf of the Center for Human Rights Research and the Critical Conversation Series, welcome to this discussion of sort of what next for prostitution laws after the Bedford decision. We have three presenters today. Jennifer Richardson, who I'll introduce in a moment. Dr. Karen Busby, from the head of the Center for Human Rights Research, many of you will know already, and then myself. So just a quick note about Jennifer. Karen and I have presented here before, so many of you will know us or about us or of us already. But Jennifer is new on campus, well not new on campus, she's been down taking courses, etc. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Jennifer, and then I'll invite Jennifer to start us off. And just to let you know, we're going to each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers. So if you want to hold your questions and answers to the end, I'll come to the front and we'll do a sort of discussion-based thing after that. So Jennifer Richardson has a Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Manitoba with focus on child exploitation and abuse investigations. She continues to work on her Master's of Social Work while on secondment to the Child Protection Branch from the New Directions for Children, Youth, and Families. Jennifer is a provincial child sexual exploitation specialist, the acting Street Reach Winnipeg coordinator, and was the program coordinator for the Core Competency Training Branch with the province from 2002 until 2009. Among other scholarly materials and articles that she's authored, Jennifer has co-written the curriculum for the province's Sexual Exploited Youth Core Competency Training. And she's also developed a risk assessment tool for TERF, and TERF stands for Training and Education Resources for Females at New Directions. Jennifer is a lecturer and a presenter at many local, national, and international venues, including for the Winnipeg Police Service and RCMP and the Provincial Child Abuse Committee. And she's been a guest speaker at the federal level for the National Victims of Crime Awareness Week in Ottawa. And she was recently nominated as a Canadian expert by the U.S. State Department, attending a leadership program that hosted a number of international delegates and alumni. So, without further ado, welcome Jennifer.
So I'll give you a little bit of my background with respect to the legal aspects of prostitution in Canada. My focus has been on children primarily. However, I have spent a lot of time working with the adults that are exploited or engaged in prostitution in Canada, and done investigations into trafficking all across Canada and in the U.S. So most of my career I've spent from a clinical standpoint. But when you're working with people who are either choosing to engage in prostitution or being exploited or trafficked, you will then encounter kind of the legal aspects of that, right, with regards to children or adults, either way. So I think after the Bedford case was finalized and looking at what Canada needs to do, I was saying to Shawna and Karen, I don't really have a firm answer, but what I do know is that just plucking a model from another country that operates very different than Canada does is not the way that we should go in Canada, especially when we look at some of those models. Personally, I don't feel that people engage in prostitution by choice. I think it's from a lack of choice generally. However, again, being that most of my work has been from a clinical standpoint, clinically, when people are coming to service providers for help or saying that they need some type of service, whatever your personal perspective is really doesn't matter. Right? So if someone's saying that I engaged in the sex trade because I chose to engage in it, or they're saying that I really didn't have a choice to engage and I got involved in that way, really clinically, it doesn't matter. But when you look at some of the models, like the Nordic or the Swedish model, I can't see a lot of scientifically rigorous research that's been developed on the outcomes of that. And looking at some of the aspects of how women who are exploited or women who choose to engage in prostitution are treated and really vulnerable there still hasn't come hasn't really come out, I don't think. People don't talk about that aspect. Generally, when people are talking about the Swedish or the Nordic model, it's usually very pro, oh, we should just bring it to Canada, you know, this is a great model, we want to say that we don't want people victimizing women, and we're going to charge, you know, just the men and leave the women alone. Again, I think that we as a country, or you know, looking at our laws, we have to look at what is going to fit in Canada. And then, you know, we know from 1984 when the Bagley report was released, and 85 when the Fraser report was released, that just the legal aspect of prostitution, we can't just look at changing the laws and then not having any other types of services or any other types of programming available to people, because the legal aspect is only one aspect of prostitution. And quite frankly, I think it's a pretty small aspect of what goes on for either women that say they engage freely or for people that say they were exploited. I think it's a fairly small aspect of it. So I think the answer is that Canada really needs to employ research on what has gone on in the countries where it's legalized. I think that Canada should also look at some of the Australian laws that have been in place and some of the Australian programs that have been operating for a long time. Nobody ever really talks about the Australian models. Maybe Shawna's going to, or Karen's going to, but I think that there are some really good aspects to programming and you know, their laws that they've put in place that people generally don't talk about as much as the Nordic or the Sweden models. So I think, you know, for me, I really feel too that we also need to look at the existing laws in trafficking and look at how do we implement them better. I can tell you that throughout my career, and I've been working with this population for about 20 years now, we have lots of investigations, but I've seen very few convictions. And because of the way the law is written, because the law solely right now depends on the victim to give 80% of the evidence to move forward in looking at charging people that are exploiting, so people that we can say are being exploited to other people. That just doesn't work, especially for children. So I think in looking at the laws, in the prostitution laws all together, we have to look at some of the other pieces in the legislation that was not struck down, right? So the procuring laws and around the children stuff and the trafficking that are really, really, really difficult to prove. And especially when we are relying on really vulnerable groups, right? And I think if you look at some of the other research that has been done, or you look at some of the women in those countries, you know, Sweden and some of the Nordic countries that talk about how they are being made to be more vulnerable, that piece is important too. Right? So if Canada was to look at doing some research and look at what have been the outcomes, I think a big piece that a lot of the critique around some of those models have been was that the people who are engaged in sex work or being exploited, whichever way you want to look at it, weren't really consulted. They weren't talked to. They haven't been talked to even since the law has been put in place as to how it's impacting them on a daily basis, what things happen to them that are negative or positive. No one is actually speaking to them, and I think it's a critical piece that Canada does not want to duplicate in developing whatever we are going to develop. Because if we do that, then I think we're just making the already vulnerable population of women, and generally it's street-involved women, which we don't see a lot of now. I'd say 80 to 90% of any type of prostitution is going on the internet. Okay, so most people are either engaged in sex work on the internet or indoors, strip clubs, massage parlors, those types of places. So the really vulnerable people are the drug-addicted women who are on the streets and who have very little voice towards how the law affects them. So I don't want to see Canada, you know, duplicate that. So my biggest pitch is that we look at having some evidence-based research on the other models, and we develop something that's specific to Canada. Canada is a country that I think we are smart enough to be able to take the good things that have happened in other countries and not duplicate the bad. And there are other models all over the place that we can look at, not just the Swedish or the Nordic model, which are often the ones that are talking about. So that's my 10 minutes, I think, right? You want me to keep talking?
Well, there'll be lots of time for discussion. I think, so.
Okay.
Thanks, Anne.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, there's so many things I could talk about. I'm not sure really where to start, but maybe I'll start by saying that feminists agree on a few things around prostitution or sex work. Well, first of all, we don't even agree on what to call it, prostitution or sex work. So I use both terms. I use them together. I use one or the other, and we can talk about the politics of the language. Shawna's talked about that before, but I kind of go back and forth between them. But feminist thinking on sex work is widely divergent, ranging from radical feminist theories that prostitution is a form of sexual violence to liberal or pro-sex theories that says sex work provides economic empowerment to women. So there are a huge range in their positions in between those two positions. But feminists agree on two things. That first is that the work of prostitutes or sex workers should not be stigmatized, and the other effects of having a criminal conviction and criminalizing aspects of the work make the work really dangerous. So criminal law makes it more difficult for women to engage in the work and makes it more dangerous for them. The other thing I think we need to really recognize is our discussion would be clearer if we recognize that some girls and some women are coerced into sex work or into prostitution, and others are there because it's a viable work occupational choice for them. And there's a real continuum of participation from coercion to choice in those who are involved in sex work. And I think if we're clear and recognize that there is that continuum, we would either recognize there are different responses based on people's reasons for engaging in the first place. We have no idea, really, empirically, how many are at the coercion end of the continuum and how many are at the choice end of the continuum. The prevalent studies are just really difficult to do in this area, so we don't know, what the range is. But we do know, that kids are involved in prostitution, and a lot of kids are involved in prostitution in Winnipeg, and at the other end, there are women who are involved because it's a choice that they make to be involved. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that the Bedford case struck down 3 laws: street solicitation, living off the avails, and keeping a calm bawdyhouse. We'll talk about what those mean in particular later if you want to. But it's really important to remember that there are lots of prostitution-related laws still in effect in Canada. So, for example, there are a variety of laws that make it a criminal offense to engage anyone under 18, so a child in prostitution. And that's really important. So those pieces are still there. They're still plagued with the problems that Jennifer mentioned around prosecution of the offenses. The problem, of course, with kids involved in prostitution is that they often have criminal records of their own. They have child welfare records. They've got lots of problems. They're often street-involved kids, so there are going to be issues. For example, if they were on drugs at the time that the offense occurred, and they get on the stand and you ask them, were you on drugs, then their credibility is going to be compromised on the stand. So that's just one simple example. Or if they've got a history of lying, and many kids do, that's a survival technique. If you're living on the street and you lie to stay alive, then your credibility can be really attacked when you're placed on the stand. So it's very difficult to get convictions in these cases, as Jennifer mentioned. But having said that, the offenses are still there for kids involved in prostitution. It's important to remember that Section 212 of the Criminal Code, one section was struck out of Section 212, and that's 212J, living off the avails of prostitution. So what that leaves is A to I. And A to I are all of the other kinds of offenses where someone forces somebody into prostitution, say by drugging them or procuring them or buying them, or a whole range of things from A to I. And one of the things that I would suggest is we need to try to be more creative about how to get at the exploiters of people who are involved in prostitution. And there's ways that we can do that, I think, using 212A to I, and forgetting about J, living off the avails of prostitution, because that's one of the provisions that's over-inclusive. So it's important to remember that all of the other procurement kind of pieces are still in place. The Bedford case also had no impact at all on the human trafficking provisions. The human trafficking provisions are still there. I think we need to find ways to make human trafficking provisions more effective and enforceable, but those are still there, and we're learning how to work with those provisions. And of course, there are numerous other provisions in the criminal code that should be able to deal with the exploitative aspects of sex work or prostitution. So prostitutes or sex workers should be able to rely on sexual assault laws. They should be able to rely on kidnapping, uttering threats, blackmail, and so on, because they face those problems all the time in the work that they do. And I think what you want to do is get, again, at the exploitative aspects of sex work, you can use other provisions in the criminal code to do that. Okay, what I mainly wanted to talk about is what's left. What did the Bedford case say in a nutshell, because we don't have a lot of time. What did it say in a nutshell about living off the avails, the communications law, and the bawdyhouse law? One of the things that the court, first of all, it's struck down under Section 7 of the Charter. So most of you here know what Section 7 says. It says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So that's what I have up on the board. And so everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. And we'll talk about principles of fundamental justice in a minute. And then if there is a violation of Section 7, then we turn to Section 1 to see if the infringement can be justified. So the court found that life, liberty, and security of the person was affected, and that it did not comport with the principles of fundamental justice, so there's a violation of Section 7. And then the Section 1 analysis is very short. It just says the law is not knowingly or minimally impairing, and the deleterious effects don't outweigh the salutary effects. So I've tried to really give you a brief overview of what Bedford says. So under life, liberty, and security of the person, it says the impediment provisions impose dangerous conditions on sex work while preventing people from taking steps to protect themselves. And that's the overarching theme throughout the decision, is that it creates dangerous conditions for sex work. And one of the things the court had to consider is it wasn't the government that the government said that's creating the dangerous conditions, it's the people on the street who are creating the dangerous conditions. And the court said all that's required is a sufficient causal connection between the law and the dangerous conditions that it created. So the court found that life, liberty, and security of the person was violated. And then we turn to the principles of fundamental justice. So is the violation in accordance with principles of fundamental justice? And here what the court focused on mainly is the disproportionate effect between what they were regulating and what the impact of the law was. And so basically they said regulating a nuisance, so the nuisance of street solicitation, for example, at the cost of health, safety, and lives is grossly disproportionate. So they found that it did not comport with the principles of fundamental justice because the effects of the law were so disproportionate to any benefit, really, of the law. And then finally on Section 1, as I mentioned, they said it was not minimally impairing, and they said the deleterious effects outweighed the salutary effects. And I don't have time to go through the analysis they went through, but I just want to point to two quotes that the court gave. So the first one, it said, the harms identified by the courts below are grossly disproportionate to the deterrence of community disruption that's the object of the law. Parliament has the power to regulate against nuisances, but not at the cost of health, safety, and lives of prostitutes. And then this, I think, is interesting. A law that prevents street prostitutes from resorting to a safe haven, such as Grandma's house, while a suspected serial killer prowls the street, is a law that's lost sight of its purpose. So pretty strong language on separating women who do sex work from supports that they could find helpful. And then this is interesting. If screening could have prevented one woman from jumping into Robert Picton's car, the severity of the harmful effects is established. So clearly the Picton inquiry was running through their mind throughout the decision. So now technically I think what this means is that the options that the government has following the Bedford case are pretty limited in what they can do if they want to reintroduce a prostitution law under the criminal law power. So obviously one option they have is to use the notwithstanding clause and to re-enact the or to sort of thumb their nose at the Supreme Court of Canada and to continue on with the bawdyhouse street solicitation ruling off the avails provision by using the notwithstanding clause. That would be unprecedented at the federal level, so I don't think that's one option that they'll take. The second option they have is to do nothing, which would be de facto decriminalization of those three sections of the criminal code. And the third option that they seem to have is to criminalize the purchase of sex, the so-called Nordic model, but not to do anything about the selling of sex. So what they do is criminalize the Johns and the customers, but not criminalize the women themselves. I have to say, and I haven't done a thorough analysis of this, but I think this is where the nub is going to come to, so what you have to remember right now is that sex work in Canada is legal. It's just so many of the things around sex work that are illegal. Paying someone to engage in sex is not criminal activity in Canada. So if the Nordic model is adopted in Canada, then there will be a fundamental change in Canadian law on prostitution. Prostitution for the first time per se will be made illegal in Canada. And here again, I'm not talking about sex with kids, I'm not talking about trafficking and so on, but the transaction itself between two consenting adults will become a criminal offense in Canada. And so we have to ask, do we want to go in that direction? I think it could result in a lot of criminalization. But I also think there could be serious problems with a law like this, and I take Jennifer's point for sure. We don't have the research on what the impacts of that will be. But if we do criminalize the activities of Johns, but not of the women themselves, it seems to me that both of these things will still happen. That what you're going to have is you're going to drive, especially street solicitation, deeper into the corners. You're going to take away the option of what currently is the safest method, which is website, telephone calls, people coming to someone's home or to a safe place to engage in sex work. You know, it's just going to get deeper and deeper into the woods. People are still going to, in my view, engage in sex work because they need the money, and men, for whatever reasons they do it, are still going to seek out prostitutes. So will we get around the problem of, of women who jump into a man's car because that's what they need to do in order to engage in the transaction, in order to stay away from law, to be able to run away from law? So given that the Supreme Court of Canada says, just read that last one, if screening would have prevented one woman from jumping into Robert Pickton's car, the severity of the harmful effects is established. So I think there's a real problem potentially with the Nordic model in that it doesn't get us away from the problems that the Supreme Court of Canada has identified and the reasons why Section 7 of the Charter were violated in the case. So I think I'll stop there and turn the floor to Oh, sorry, there was one other thing I wanted to mention, Shawna, and then I'll turn it over to you. The federal government is engaging in a consultation right now, and they have a one-page consultation paper. You can go to the Department of Justice website. If you just type in Bedford Consultation Canada, you'll get it. So you can see their consultation paper, which is pretty thin. And then they're asking Canadians for their opinions on a range of questions, and these are the questions that they've put up. And so maybe after Shawna's done her presentation during the discussion period, I'll put these questions back up for discussion. And I have to say that as a process matter, I think it's problematic to engage in this kind of consultation, because I think what they're hoping for is to have the vast majority of Canadians say, we must do something, in kind of a panic presentation. And it'd be interesting to see what comes out of the consultation, but I'll put that back up later on. Okay.
So just while I'm setting up the PowerPoint here, the last statistic I had heard on the number of people who had responded to that survey was 13,000. That was a week ago. So we are getting a lot of responses. Okay, so we're going to see if this is going to switch. Okay. So Karen had mentioned the Nordic, or what we often refer to as the Swedish model. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the problems with the Nordic or Swedish model. And you heard, some of you who have been attending some of the Critical Conversation Series discussions have heard Amy Leibovich and I speak in detail about the problems related to the Swedish model in particular. So I'm not going to go into depth on that, but those slides are available on the CHRR website on the Critical Conversation Series. Amy's and my slides are available there for download. So first of all, the Nordic model is kind of a misnomer. There are 5 Nordic countries. Only 2 of those countries have actually adopted what's often called the the end demand model, right? The criminalization of clients or Johns, the idea that if you end demand for sex work will go away entirely. Under the end demand model, what we get is the setting up of sex workers as exclusively women and clients as exclusively men, and then sex workers read through the lens, through that radical feminist lens, as violence against women. So under that kind of rubric, it's impossible to participate willingly in sex work, or you get read as participating in a form of violence against yourself in the context of sex work. So what happens under that kind of gendering of the model is that people who are trans, male sex workers get figured out of the equation entirely. And as I think both Karen and Jen have said, we don't really have any reliable statistics on the numbers of people who participate or the genders of people who participate in the sex trade. But we do know for sure that not all sex workers are women and not all clients are men. So the model, the framing of the model in itself is flawed. Sweden was the first country to enact the model, so we often call it really the Swedish criminalization regime rather than the Nordic model. Two other Nordic countries actually considered and dismissed the model, and it has been considered by a number of other countries around the world and dismissed. So we don't want to sort of operate under the delusion that all of the Nordic countries are on board with this, and in fact there hasn't been debate. There is debate, and there's ongoing debate even in Sweden at this time about it. One of the other things that often happens, and that I see happening in the Canadian context right now around the Nordic model or the Swedish model, is that it gets presented as an innovative or new approach, particularly in the Canadian context, and frankly, that's not the case. There are a number of cities, our own included now, where police have been unofficially not arresting sex workers and targeting clients for a couple of months officially in the Winnipeg context, though I suspect it's been going on a little bit longer in the Winnipeg context than that, in unofficial ways. And then Vancouver, Ottawa, and Montreal also have unofficial Swedish models happening at the level of policing. So it's not a new legal framework, and it doesn't eradicate sex work by ending demand. It targets demand, but we know, because we see sex workers on the streets in the cities in our own city or on the streets in other cities. We also see the ads in papers and online. We know that sex work continues regardless of the efforts that we make to police it. So one of the other things that often gets talked about in the context of the Swedish model is resources that get put in place to help women, almost always women, exit from the trade. So at the surface, this would seem good. Yes, we want those who don't want to be doing the work to be able to exit. And this is one thing that we call this sort of pro-decrims and the antis will agree on. We want those who want out of the trade to be able to get out of the trade. And we want them to get out without a criminal record and without all of those kinds of barriers to success in other areas of their lives that they might otherwise get if they were criminalized. But what happens, particularly in Sweden, and we do have some research out of Sweden now, it is difficult to get research because of translation issues in particular, but also because a lot of the research we get out of Sweden is produced by the government about their own policies, and we find it quite biased and often rife with factual errors. But basically, what we find from the research that we do have is that the services that are put in place are used to coerce people. So, for example, police, and Amy talked a little bit about this based on the reports by Pi Jacobson, a sex worker who has done a little bit of research with academics in the Swedish context, has said that police will sort of stake out and watch until a transaction has taken place. Often they have to really surveil, yes, because they need to see that sex has happened. At which point they will go into a sex worker's place, or they'll sort of go up to arrest the sex worker. If they're going into her house, then they'll often bring social workers with them. And there will be this kind of, okay, so you need help, don't you? You don't want to be criminalized. Basically what we have is a kind of pressure on people to get out of sex work that can and has been coercive, and that sex workers experience as a form of victimization in and of itself. So the whole sort of, we're going out to save people and we're going to save them even if they don't want to be saved thing comes into it. This is something that Laura Augustin, anthropologist working in the US, she writes the blog The Naked Anthropologist, has called the rescue industry. It's a kind of mantra of the rescue industry, meaning those of you who don't understand that you're exploited, suffer from false consciousness, you don't really understand the nature of your own lives or your own work, you are in fact victims, we know better than you, and here's how we're going to help you, even if you say you don't want help. Right? And the things that they can use to sort of coerce someone into a program of whatever kind involve the removal of their children or the threat of the loss of housing. This is a problem in, I think it's Denmark right now. Police will sort of notify a landlord, and the landlord will kick someone out if they know they're doing sex work in their particular building. So there's an increased homelessness that's associated with the Swedish model or the Nordic model if we look at it in the Denmark context. So basically what we're seeing is a Swedish model that is in fact failing to protect the people that it purports to protect, right? And it's framing people specifically as victims. And what we also see in the research and in the sort of anecdotal accounts from sex workers coming out of Sweden is that sex workers are not consulted. So there's a construction of a whole group of people as victims and as incapable of speaking about their own lives on behalf of themselves. So if we think about what that might look like in the Canadian context, what we get then is a development of laws, policies, programs that wouldn't necessarily reflect the voices and needs of the populations that they're all set out to help. Yes? Will we do this with any other group? Would we, for example, develop health policy without consulting doctors or nurses? We can talk a little bit more about that in a second. I think I'm probably running down a little bit on time. So what a number of us in Canada are proposing is what we're calling the Made in Canada New Zealand model. In New Zealand, sex work has been decriminalized, and what happened was the New Zealand Prostitution Reform Act, or the PRA, was put in place in 2003. And it's an excellent example of how criminal law reform can, in fact, safeguard the human rights of sex workers and protect them from exploitation. This was a law that was put in place after deep and intense and ongoing consultations with sex worker populations. And prior to the enactment of the PRA in 2003, New Zealand's prostitution laws were very similar to the ones that we have in Canada. So as another Commonwealth country, the New Zealand framework is a framework that is going to be useful for Canada, another Commonwealth country, to look at. And as any number of national and international bodies have argued, criminalization of sex workers or their clients constitutes a form of structural violence against sex workers, right? So the World Health Organization published a report in 2005 and another one again in 2013 saying that either form, whether we have the so-called end-demand model where you criminalize clients only, or the model that we had prior to the Bedford decision here in Canada where we basically were criminalizing those who sell sex. Right, sex workers were the ones who were most often disproportionately arrested as opposed to Johns in the Canadian context. Either of those criminalization models constitutes, in the eyes of the World Health Organization and in the eyes of any number of those who've conducted research here in Canada and abroad, a form of structural violence that we need to move away from in order to start to address the harms that sex workers experience, and in order to start to address the stigma associated with any form of so-called transgressive sexuality and any form of poverty, colonization, all of these kinds of things that contribute to populations of people being largely vulnerable or very vulnerable. What we want to do is multiply the options that are available to people, and criminalization doesn't multiply those options, it pushes them, it decreases the number of options available to people. So just a couple of statistics about the PRA, and then we'll go on to the question and answer section. But based on what research we have coming out of New Zealand, and this is a little bit easier to get because it's in English, so we don't have to wait for the translation process to happen. But the PRA did not result in any growth of the sex industry. It didn't increase the number of sex workers. And it has had a marked effect, according to sex worker organizations as well as government in that context, in safeguarding sex workers' human and labor rights. And what we see is sex workers empowered to negotiate, to screen clients, to work indoors if they wish, to work in, and a particularly interesting aspect of the New Zealand model is that it privileges small businesses, so we get a push against that kind of giant brothel, corporate brothel thing that the aunties will talk about, particularly happening in the US around the Bunny Ranch, for example. In the New Zealand context, you get a privileging of those who operate in a business of 3 people or less. I think it's 3. It's either 3 or 7 people or less. And the businesses who have more than that will pay more for their licensing. So what we have is a foregrounding of an effort to really facilitate a kind of cooperative and small business approach. So you eliminate or try to eliminate it to the best of your ability the very negative effects of global capitalism, for example, on the sex industry. I'll leave it there, and maybe we can move to the Q&A section. Did you want to put up that?
Those questions, maybe.
Okay.
So, over to you for discussion. That was kind of fast and furious, but we really wanted to mainly have discussion today. And some of you might not realize this, but obviously Joyce Smith's not here. She canceled on Friday. She said she had to remain in Ottawa over the weekend and couldn't be here today. So we're sorry that she's not here, because we really wanted to get the perspective of somebody from the government. So, thanks.
Probably any of you can speak to it, but I think Jennifer, you were talking a bit about the Australian model, and I was just wondering if you could give like a 101 of that, or maybe just have the bits that you think would be useful to Canadian.
One of the things that I really like about it is they have safe zones, where, police will go into those zones. They don't rest in they can tell a woman to move on, meaning they have to leave the area for a certain period of time, and it's generally shorter periods of time. The thing I like the most for street involved, because street involved work generally is a little more dangerous because there isn't oftentimes people around, is that they have safe houses as well, where women can go and, the people who are running the house have to have lighting and security and condoms and things that sex workers would need, people who are exploited would need, to keep themselves safe and to have more security. So a place where they wouldn't be in the back lane, right, by themselves, or trying to, that's one of the things that, the critics of the Nordic distribution model talk about, right, is that, as Shawna was saying, because there's so much surveillance on the demand side now, people are having to go move more and more underground, and away from safety. So I think that the Australian model allows for a little bit more safety, for the more vulnerable women. And I think street sex work is the most vulnerable. Out of all the entire sex trade, that is the most vulnerable, and generally the most marginalized people, and generally, like I said, the people have very little voice in what occurs on the street.
If I could just follow up on that a little bit, Casey, there's a great article in Canadian Journal of Women in the Law about 3 years ago on the New Zealand model, which is a little bit different from the Australian model, so if you wanted to read it, you could have a look at it. But one of the problems that they point out with the New Zealand legislation is it essentially allows for the small businesses to operate, so you can have a bawdy house as long as that's less than 3 sex workers who are involved. I think it's 3, yeah. But you should go to the article, it's a great article. But one of the things that they found is there was a local option in cities to not allow bawdy houses to open, and most of the cities in New Zealand, in fact, passed restrictive bylaws to prevent bawdy houses from opening. So it's an economic development model, if you will, that was then stifled by local control. So there are lessons to be learned, I think, from other countries. Something else, there's a debate right now on a listserv that I'm on, saying that if prostitution was legalized in Canada, then women who are on welfare would be told, get a job. sex work. So there's a whole debate on the online service today. But the model in New Zealand specifically says that if people don't want to do this work, they couldn't be forced into it. So there's a whole long section. Because there's lots of stories out there that women are forced by welfare authorities into sex work. Stories like that swirl all the time around the Netherlands and Germany. But if they're true, which I suspect they may not be, there's ways you can legislatively take care of that in the New Zealand model as well. You can follow that.
In Germany, we have seen these huge corporate brothels now, like chains of brothels owned by large corporations. The women, again, are not, they're not making the money. It's the people who own them and the men that are making the money off of those. And you see them popping up everywhere in Germany.
The Australian model, too, just to give a brief overview of it then, is that it's been enacted in New South Wales only, as far as I know, but there's another state that's considering it. And it's often touted as a decriminalization model, but as Jennifer has already highlighted, what we get is a kind of legalization or a regulated prostitution context in New South Wales. So there are zoning laws that prevent engaging in sex work at the street level or in a brothel around a school, a church, or a residential neighborhood. There are different kinds of regulations in place. But as we see in both the New Zealand and the Australian or the New South Wales model, is that, as Jennifer said before, eliminating the sort of legal frames that target sex workers doesn't really address the stigma. So we get the stigma of sex work that results in zoning laws, for example, that keep people out of their own neighborhoods, or that results in municipalities limiting the number or not allowing anyone to set up those kinds of businesses. So the stigma remains, and the decriminalization is the first step in a long process of trying to strip away the things that target and victimize people.
Andrew?
Question for Professor Busby. I'm wondering about kind of the significance of this case as it relates to Section 7. Do you think this is just sort of a natural progression, or is this another sort of sign that Section 7 is broadening? And I'm thinking of it kind of in the context when read against a case like PHS. Is Section 7, with proper kind of evidence to support it, becoming kind of a cure-all for all bad laws almost? It seems like it's becoming very broad, and both decisions I think are really strongly written.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because it's clearly situated in Section 7, right? And I mean, maybe Deborah, you've got a response on that. I don't know if you specifically looked at this in the context of Section 7 and if this is a broadening of Section 7. I mean, I will admit some surprise to the outcome. It's, in terms of judicial activism, it's a big step to strike down 3 long-standing laws in Canada. But having said that, it was a long trial with a lot of social science evidence and very strong findings at the trial level. So, it was put in a really strong way. And the court was willing to, the quotes that I put up before, if it harms, what's really interesting jurisprudentially is it says, if this law harms one person, that's enough to capture Section 7. You still have to get through Section 1, but this case continues that tradition where Section 1 is not used in Section 7 cases to justify government action. So it's a really interesting piece, but I don't know if you've got comments on the jurisprudential significance of Bedford for Section 7.
Well, I haven't looked at it in any great detail. What I do, I was actually surprised at the strength of the decision on Section 7. Given what we've seen, I think the PHS or the Insight case that Andrew's mentioning is, that was a significant case too, but there's lots of reasons why you can give a very narrow reading to that case in terms of it not, they didn't strike down the drug laws. They just said that the minister had to grant the exemption, which is a very different thing, right? So the fact that striking down the laws here was the remedy and was what it was all about. There wasn't another way they could do it, arguably, and still be true to the analysis under Section 7 that's developing. But I still think it's a pretty significant decision, and it does have implications, I think, in other areas around other kinds of cases in the criminal law realm, like obviously the Carter case on assisted suicide and some of these other cases that are before the courts right now. So yeah, I think it is a significant decision. How far we're going to go with Section 7 being a cure-all for bad laws, I don't know. One of the things that I'm interested in, I won't take a lot of time on it, is the analysis that they use there in terms of gross disproportionality is quite loose in many ways. And I look at gross disproportionality in my work on sentencing, on mandatory minimums, and there you have a very tight, narrow, it's very hard to prove gross disproportionality in that context, although we have some lower court decisions finding mandatory sentences invalid. I don't think the Supreme Court's going to go there on Section 12, where the gross disproportionality analysis, that's what I'm saying, has come from. So, I think there's still more sort of analysis to be done, and we need to see where the other cases go, but I think it's a significant and stronger decision than many of us had expected.
You had a question?
So more practically speaking, I know, Professor Busby, you had laid out sort of what can be done now that it's in the hands of the government. And I just wondered, I mean, as a Watson, I always understand sort of the legislative process now insofar as like drafting and what they might do if they do anything. But I'm just curious, like practically, and I don't know if any of you could maybe speak to this, who has sort of like their hands in this, and who is going to be speaking to what's going to happen, and practically, what do you think might come out of like this happening under this government now?
I mean, it's a good question. They have a year, so they need to introduce something before a year is up. So they've got till December, let's say 20th.
The word on the street right now is that they're going to bring something down before the summer break,
Yeah, they'll do something quickly.
and it will be a Nordic model. So-
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it's going to be. So the consultation was February 17th to March 17th, so you can participate until then. But I think that's mostly show. I don't think that will do very much, really, to influence where they're going to go. And I expect they'll draft something that looks like a Nordic model.
The word we're getting is that it's already pretty much drafted.
Yeah. But the thing is, I just don't know if the Nordic model will take care of the problems that's been identified by the Supreme Court of Canada. So, if you remember, I mean, keep in mind that quote from about Robson Picton. If one woman, if this would impact the safety of even one woman in how she will react if she's doing street solicitation, then there's a grossly disproportionate effect. So let's put that in the context of the Nordic model, where women, I think, still engage in sex work. They're still going to engage in unsafe ways, if not to protect themselves against getting a criminal charge, but to protect their Johns from getting a criminal charge, because it's going to be the only way. Like, think about it apart from the law. What if we use the Nordic model? Will that change the behavior of women on the street who are engaged in sex work? It won't, because the only way they're going to be able to do it is if they are able to protect the identity of the man that they're assuming that it's gender, which it is mainly. It's just an easier way to talk about it. They're still going to get in the car in unsafe conditions, and they're still going to go to unsafe places to avoid detection. So it's not going to take care of the disproportionate impact that the law has on the safety of women. So the impact of that, I think, is the Nordic model will be reintroduced, and then we'll have another case, and they won't be upheld because it I think, does not get around the problems that we face. So in my view, Canada has the option of decriminalizing altogether, moving to a regulatory model, or criminalizing only. But we'll see.
I don't have much to add, except that what Karen is saying is what I'm hearing from other legal sources associated with the pro-decrim side of the case. It's any form of Swedish or Nordic model that comes down will result in people going back to court. That's being struck down again.
And there's no way to circumvent that except if like that's what happened. Is that right?
Not with this government.
Right.
Like with the sort of hardline, tough on crime law and order regime, like the Nordic model is the best way for this government to look like they're acknowledging the Bedford case and stay true to their sort of electoral base. And Real Women of Canada and the Catholic Civil Rights League, like all of the far-right interveners in the Bedford case, the ones who were completely discredited in court, are still being called to the table by government because they've had some secret, I guess, consultations, not so secret because I heard about it, but there are a bunch of people who were invited to speak to Peter MacKay, and everything was recorded, and there was and that was the extent he was asked at that time if there would be any more consultations aside from the online forum, and basically said no, that was it.
But to be fair, Shawna, there are lots of feminist organizations, self-defined feminist organizations that take the same view. And in fact, most of the interveners that participated in the Bedford case that would identify as feminists did take the view that the Swedish model is the appropriate model to be introduced in Canada, so.
I wouldn't say most. I'd say there was a 50-50 split in the feminist approaches, yeah.
Before the court?
Yep.
Okay. But lots of organizations are taking positions against, and lots, like Leaf didn't participate in Bedford because they couldn't figure out which side it was on, so, it wasn't there. So there are splits for sure in, what is the appropriate approach to take. Jennifer?
Procedurally, if they were to enact a Nordic model law and someone wanted to challenge that constitutionally, would they be forced to sort of gather new evidence of harm under this law, and how many people would have to be harmed in the process before they would realize this is a bad approach?
I mean, one of the things that was extraordinary, I think, in the Bedford case is there was a lot of research that had been done on street solicitation in Canada. Would that research be useful? And again, I don't know, because obviously you're not going to have the research on the new model right in place. And then you get into the question of what kind, when social science research is unavailable or inconclusive, what research do you use? We know the rules under Section 1, which are, common sense can be good enough. Will common sense be good enough under Section 7? I don't know the answer to that question.
How big of a factor in these laws do you think the whole kind of not in my backyard mentality is? When you look at the way everything's kind of set up and enforced, and the fact that you can log on to Craigslist and very easily kind of transact a legal transaction with a sex worker, and then how aggressively or how differently street work is treated. Do you think that is kind of the primary driving factor?
I think it's a huge factor. My program is jointly operated with Winnipeg Police, and like Shawna said, police haven't been charging. They have been charging women for a number of years, but the charges are always stayed. And then women can go to a camp, and that's been going on in Winnipeg and in Toronto even, pretty much in almost every city in Canada for years, unofficially, like Shawna said. There's the charge is still there. And it's stayed, but I think often when police are responding to prostitution, it's from that nuisance perspective that, we don't want it on the street. Anyone, who logs on to, there's, thousands of websites right now where, yeah, you can legally, engage in sex trade. It's when it's seen, it's when it's public. I mean, that's even prior to the Bedford case. Prostitution has always been legal in Canada as long as it's not public. So as long as it happens in a hotel room, as long as it happens in someone's house, just not repeatedly, because then you can be charged with bawdyhouse. Like Karen said, there's all sorts of other laws. It's still illegal to transport someone knowingly to a bawdyhouse. But so again, I do think it's the nuisance factor where people don't want to acknowledge that sex workers are a part of the community. Oftentimes people, when I'm teaching, people say to me, well, I live in the West End and I walk by sex workers, I never know should I engage them or not. Questions like that are asked all the time, right? So, well, if you see somebody who looks like they're, why wouldn't you say hello, right? Like you would any other neighbor, So I do think the nuisance factor is a huge perspective that pushes, the legal stuff in Canada all the time, has for a long, long time, probably always will for the street stuff.
There's a really interesting study from Vancouver that Becky Ross did. And she has a website. She's a sociologist, and we just Google Becky Ross, and it's the West End Street Project, or basically she did a research into sex worker activism and sort of neighborhood activism that was anti-prostitution in Vancouver, and it traces this long, long line of all of the stuff that's not either obviously religiously motivated or coming from a specifically feminist or radical feminist perspective. Any other grassroots activism is pure NIMBY. Get them off our streets, and then there's a kind of John Lohman, a longtime researcher, criminologist at Simon Fraser University, has done a ton of research on this as well. There's this huge, what's called a discourse of disposal around sex workers, right? The best way to get rid of sex work is to get people off the street. And so Robert Picton, for example, could be viewed as doing a community service.
I want to respond to that in two ways that are slightly contradictory. I grew up in the West End of Winnipeg, and as a teenager, I could barely walk down Ellis Avenue because I would be harassed every single block. And men would circle around and circle around and circle around. I'd be asked by the same men 10 times on my walk from the Y, which is in the Bay, to where I lived on Notre Dame and Arlington. And we didn't have a car. I came from a big family, and it was gross. That's the only way I can describe it. And I was scared a lot of the time because I thought someone will drive up and pull me into a car. So I don't want to discount the nuisance factor in some neighborhoods. It's actually really scary and really dangerous. So, I think you have to acknowledge that. Having said that, what the Supreme Court of Canada says repeatedly in the decision is that the nuisance factor cannot be more important than the safety factor for women who are engaged in sex work. And that's where the grossly disproportionate analysis comes from. And they say the objective of the legislation is to prevent nuisance. So one of the ways that I think is really useful to think about what the new law would be is what's the objective of the new law? And to really tie the objective then to how the law operates. So figure out what is the objective of the law. If the objective of the law is to keep women safe who are involved in sex work, then what kind of law would you have that would achieve that objective? So, but the nuisance factor is clearly animating the Supreme Court of Canada's decision. And to the extent that governments tried to argue, but what we're trying to do is protect sex workers, the court said, no, you're not. That's clear that that's not what this legislation is intended to do. This legislation is to protect the community against the harms of prostitution, in particular the nuisance factor. So I think I'm not sure what the answer is, but if you reconstructed the objective as something else, how would your answer be different?
Yeah, and I would agree with the nuisance factor does place communities at risk. There's lots of the children that I've worked with, 8 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old, that have been procured into the sex trade in impoverished areas in Winnipeg purely for McDonald's. Come in the car, get with me, I'll take you to McDonald's, or I'll buy you, a nice shirt, or I'll buy you a nice CD, but you have to do this in the back of the car. So the nuisance factor is there on both sides, but I think it could be, we could eliminate that for the community and for the women, I think.
Or the girls.
Right, yeah, and the kids in the community. I don't think that's an impossible venture for us to undertake, looking at some of the legislation, or the legislation put in place.
I guess I'm in my 4th decade of law enforcement now, and I've worked with Jennifer in the past. And one thing that I think you mentioned was a big focus on more resources for helping women exit the sex trade. And that's a big aspect of the Nordic model that I think that is really good. We need huge resources and intervention resources and programs outside of focusing just on that small aspect of the law that's enforceable. But what I wanted to ask is, with my experience, I've got 3 daughters, and the work I've done with sexually exploited people, I have a problem with the idea of consent, because I know a lot of them are groomed into the sex trade when they're too young to consent. So even a woman who's 18 or 19 years old, I just have a feeling that they can't freely consent because they don't know what they're getting into. And there's lots of research that shows all the violence that they experience. So how can they freely consent to that? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I can talk a little bit about it, and consent is one of the things that comes up really quite often in debates between the sort of pro-decrim and anti-sex work people. And frankly, I think consent is kind of a red herring. Whether someone is consenting or not, the idea is open up options. If you want out, here's how you get out. And one of the ways to help people get out is to not stick them with a criminal record, for example, and to not criminalize clients, which then sort of presents them with this whole other, as we've talked about already, which pushes the sex trade into darker and more obscure areas of the city, and it makes people less safe. So talking about whether or not people have chosen to get in is really not a helpful way, in part because, like you said, it's difficult to determine when and how consent happens, but also in part because what we really want is to increase people's options. And the best way to increase options is to allow them to talk freely about the activities that they're engaged in, allow people to ask for help without attracting stigma, or allow people to identify what they're doing without immediately being stigmatized or shunted into a program specific for. Like there's a form of kind of victim labeling that goes along with some of the very well-intentioned exit programs. And I've seen it here in the Winnipeg context, and I've read about it in other contexts, and a number of the sex worker activists that I work with have talked about it as well. There's a kind of performance of the victim that is required of people in order to access certain kinds of services. And it's not exclusive to sex work, right? We see it happening for people who access different kinds of sort of welfare or social supports in other areas, or from other professions. But what we really want to do is maximize opportunities for people to either get out or stay in and stay safe, or access counseling, or get child support, or get training to do other kinds of jobs. What we don't want to do is get caught up in a, well, did you choose it or did you not choose it? We just want to say, here are all of these choices. Which one appeals most to you? If you've got secure housing, for example, if your kids are taken care of, if you know for sure that you're going to be able to pay for whatever your kids need at the end of this month, then what do you want to do?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the children being exploited is non-negotiable. And I do know that there are people who go and purchase sex and don't mean to get the child, and they end up having a 16-year-old. And I do a lot of work on the street, and sometimes you drive by somebody and they look 19, and you stop them and they're really 16. So I know that happens, but I also know that there are men who specifically go out and target children to have sex with. So probably raising the age to, and I know for Shawna's not Shawna had this baby too. I would raise the age to 21. Again, I think from my perspective, and I know though that won't stop it. I know that people will then, and children will then, 18, 19-year-olds, would still attempt to engage in it in some other way if they needed to, and that was the only other viable option they had. But for me too, having children that are 18, 17, 19, 20, sometimes I look at them and I think you can't make a good decision, with all of the options you already do have. And for me too, I don't know personally in my 20 years, I don't know a lot of women that say to me they chose to be engaged once they had other options. When they're in it, when they don't have any other options, for me it's a very survival instinct to say that this is what I'm choosing to do. And I get this is my body, leave me alone, don't tell me about my choice, because to say anything else at the time I think is detrimental to themselves, and that's why I said clinically, if somebody tells me they choose or they don't choose, it doesn't really matter to me. Theoretically or prospectively, even politically, it's a bit different. But I think I would look at it being 21 before people could legally consent. Again, though, knowing people would illegally engage, because I have a team of 7 police officers and 7 social workers, and we all day long find children that have been exploited and trafficked. And some will say at 12 years old, I'm choosing to have sex with this guy for $50. 10 years old, I'm choosing to have sex with this guy. So, at some point in time we do, when we're looking at whatever we do, we have to look at at what age do we think people can make that decision. But I do agree with, what Shawna said, we don't want to cut off people's options either. If they are, 19 and they have engaged, and all of a sudden maybe that's not good, or it is good for both men and women, because the male sex trade is even more hidden than the female sex trade. And it's a completely other a separate ballgame from the female one, but it's even much more hidden and much more stigmatized and all of those things. And I agree with Shawna when she says, even when you look at all over the world, the stigma of being a sex worker or exploited or trafficked is still very prevalent in all those countries. And I think we need to work as a country to look at how do we get away from that too, because that's very damaging to people. When programs, you know, and that's one of my biggest issues with this Swedish law. And I was in Toronto speaking to the Canadian Women's Foundation about this, that people who really, you know, abolitionists all look at kind of the victim standpoint, don't look at any other perspective of it, say, you know, you gotta get out, you gotta get out, you gotta get out, and force people or coerce people. What people don't realize is that people can exit from being exploited or being engaged in the sex trade, and they still might be dealing with the stigma of that 15 years later, where, you know, they might have been exploited at 18 or 16, and they're looking at getting married at 27, and they have to tell the person that they're getting married to, guess what, I used to be a hooker, I used to be a prostitute, or I used to be exploited. That is psychologically damaging to people because of the stigma that's associated, even if they've been exited for 10 years. And I think a lot of times abolitionists don't recognize that the trauma of exiting is sometimes as bad for people as the trauma of being in. Or things bad, the bad things that can happen to women or children when they're in, sometimes exiting can be just as bad because of the stigma and how they're treated in society after they exit. I always tell people that we have to remember sometimes the sex trade meets people's needs, or more. It always meets people's needs, or they wouldn't stay engaged in it, right? And when they leave, a lot of times their needs are not being met, and they're very marginalized. So I think we have to really focus on that.
I was involved in a large study 10 years ago where we interviewed 45 women who had been involved in the sex trade as children. For ethical reasons, we didn't want to interview children, so we interviewed them as young women. And it was a really interesting study. A few things that came out of it was one that was quite shocking. Every single one of them had been charged with street solicitation at some point. Because, of course, they're victims, but they're also criminals under the criminal code, right? There isn't a prohibition on, if you solicit someone on the street, you've committed a criminal offense. It doesn't matter if you're 14 or 40, you know, you've committed a criminal offense. So we've stopped charging, it seems, we've stopped charging kids as criminals, but that still could happen under the criminal code. They're still technically engaging in criminal activity, so that was interesting. But what I wanted to add is that, you know, we asked, about half of the women that we interviewed had left, and half were still involved in sex work or prostitution. And none of them were particularly happy about, you know, being involved in the work. So this wasn't a joyfully chosen way of making money. It wasn't something that they wanted to do. But those who had left, we asked them what were the conditions under which they felt they could leave. That was one of the questions that we really explored with them. And almost to a person, it was because they had developed a relationship with someone in a social service agency, and when a crisis occurred, they were there to help them, and the crisis was enough for them to be able to now be in a state of mind where they could accept the help that was offered to them. So they got pregnant, they were viciously sexually assaulted, a friend was killed, you know, some crisis like that had occurred, and that was enough for them to say, okay, I need help. And if the help was there and there was trusting relationships, then it worked. So I really want to reiterate that services need to be available, trusting relationships need to be available. But what doesn't count, I don't think, and so this gets back to your question, is, you know, and to some of the things that Shawna was saying, if you're arrested, that's not going to be perceived as an opportunity. You know, if the reason why you're pulled in is because of an arrest, then that's not, you can't dress up coercion as help. It has to be help that comes from a place where it says, I'm going to address your needs as they arise, and when you're ready, I'll be there to help you get out. One of the things, though, I think is really promising, and it gets to the problem with prosecutions, is a program, and it's in the early stages, and I don't know that much about the program, so it might not work at all. But I do think that there are ways that police can work with girls and women who are on the street and develop trusting relationships with them, and figure out ways that if they do want to prosecute the exploiters, and I don't want to I don't want to cover over the fact that there are many pimps who exploit the kids that they're involved with or the women that they're involved with. But the only way you're ever going to get enough evidence to be able to go after those guys is if you have a trusting relationship with the women and the girls who are in the trade. So I think if police had an attitude of, I'm not looking here to charge, I'm looking here to develop a trusting relationship, then, which is a program that police currently have, I understand, where they're on the street trying to just keep eyes on the ground and see what's going on. I think that would be a more fruitful way to get at the exploiters, and then you don't have to rely on the simple provision of living with the avails. You can go after the procurers and the exploiters.
That's actually the program that Bob and I designed
Okay.
in '09, and the basis of it is that the police officer is assigned to children to develop a relationship to, hopefully, if and when they're, people have victimized them, that they will then disclose that, because forensic interviewing, which is prominent in Canada right now, sucks for this population. It doesn't work. These kids could never go in cold and disclose what's going on for them. Hence why you see such little criminal investigations for people who are exploiting kids. But one of the things we found is that even with that, the amount of time it takes, and from working in the field, not from a law enforcement or government perspective, but from working in the field and community organization, sometimes it can take up to 3 years to develop that relationship with kids. And one of the problems that we've identified within WPS is that the detectives move every 2 years. So they might then be in child abuse, or then be back in GP or wherever. But one of the things that Bob and I were really pushed the Justice Department on when we started developing the program that's called Straight Reach Winnipeg, or the High Risk Victims Unit is what it's better known as, was that we wanted to use provincial legislation under the Child Family Services Act to go after people that were exploiting children, and we're the first province to do it in Canada. Manitoba has the highest penalty for violations under the Child and Family Services Act. Under the Child and Family Services Act, I have a very large mandate and have a lot of authority under that act. So I can tell a police officer that if someone has interfered under section 52 of the Child and Family Services Act, someone has interfered with my ability to carry out the mandate of this act, and then I need to be able to hence prove that so the police can charge in good faith. But under that act, I never talk to a child. I don't use any evidence from the child, so that the child is not put through kind of the rigors of our criminal justice system, which tends to then re-victimize those kids, because as Karen mentioned, that their credibility is not good. And lots of times, kids who are exploited are very vulnerable already, cognitively or developmentally. They're often children in care, so they're already compromised a lot. So we've looked at trying to use different pieces of legislation to go after people who are exploiting children. Manitoba also has the Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Act, which allows me as a social worker or police officer to take out a protection order on someone that is exploiting a child, and that through other means has not stopped engaging in that activity. It's based on the balance of probabilities, so we have to swear it out in front of a JJP, and then more likely than not, that if we do not enact this piece of legislation, that this child will continue to be harmed. So those two pieces of legislation that we've attempted to use so that we're not having to use children to prove up cases are very, every child welfare agency or piece of legislation in the country has something similar, but no one else has used it. No one else has even thought about using it. And we just received, it's a summary conviction, so we just received a 3-month custody sentence on a summary conviction, which is unheard of, right? It's very similar to getting a speeding ticket, really. And a 3-month custody sentence is, the first of its kind. So they can get up to 2 years in jail or $50,000 fine under that piece of legislation, and we don't use kids. So that for children is very helpful. But yeah, I think the police, and I've worked with police for a long time, I really think the police for the most part, and I'm not saying all police officers get it, because they don't, but I think the specialty units have really recognized that they do need to have more contact in a different way other than charging the women on the street. They recognize that it's not effective, right? Even if they do get charged, conditions are put on them with boundaries, and all that does is move the sex trade further out. So I think there is some recognition of that.
I'm glad that we've moved back to talking about adult because children engaging in
is not the Bedford
prostitution
case.
is not the Bedford case at all, and none of the laws that will be developed will address, right? Because child sexual exploitation is child sexual exploitation under the law, and that's not one of the things that was at the Bedford case that goes in the challenged. What we do want to think about, however, is in the context of any new legal regime, if we are going to be protecting people in the sex trade, then we need to start to think about the harms that have been caused to sex workers by laws in the past. So people who have multiple charges or convictions on their records, can we have a clean slate clause under either the Swedish or New Zealand model? Like, shouldn't there be a clean slate clause? There are people that I know who have tried to exit but can't exit because they can't get a job. Or there are people I know who, there are people I work with on a relatively regular basis who have to depend on partners for rental agreements because they can't disclose their occupation in a rental agreement, which means they actually are completely dependent on people that, you know, sometimes they're very dependable, sometimes they're not. There are also people who lose their apartments regularly in Canada because their landlords find out that they are sex workers, and whether or not they're bringing people back to their homes, they're getting kicked out. So we need protections that stabilize people's lives so that they can make choices. Whether they choose to stay in the trade or whether they don't, we need protections that stabilize people's lives and that eliminate stigma associated with sex work. There was a question here.
Are there any prospects for the decriminalized public health model as a way of extricating ourselves from this purely punitive discussion?
Decriminalize public health.
Treating the whole issue as a matter of public health. Now that may or may not require a registry, but
Currently in Winnipeg, if you have an escort service, you have to get a license, and it's by far and away the most expensive license, business license, like by magnitude of 10 times more than what you pay for a pawn shop license. But having said that, it's purely revenue generating. Pretty much there's questions around the license about where it can be located when it's first enacted, but there are no regulatory mechanisms attached to that, such as inspections and so on. Yeah. And Shawna's probably better to speak to, you know, the question, but I think we've long ago moved away from the idea of the diseased prostitute who is the vector of infection for others. And you know, to use, I think a lot of people would be fearful of a public health model. Jamie Blanchard's done really interesting research in India on sex workers who work with other sex workers, where they use a peer involvement model to learn safe sex practices and to have John's lists and that sort of thing. And he's going to start some projects here in Winnipeg, but I think we really want to be careful not to have a notion that prostitutes are a place where, you know, a source of disease, and to be really careful about that model.
Yeah, sex worker activists are really not in favor of framing or talking about sex work in the context of public health for all of the reasons that Karen has outlined. And we have, sex worker activists have a long history in Canada of trying to access appropriate health care. Sure. And there are a number of organizations that actually have medical clinics set up at their organizations so that the people who access the services can avoid this stigma. Because people won't identify as a sex worker if they go to a regular doctor, or if they go into an emergency department even. If someone's been assaulted and goes into HSC here in Winnipeg, it's very rare that they'll actually tell the doctor or nurse treating them that they're a sex worker. And when it happens, and my partner works in HSC, when it happens, the treatment they get is stigma-laden and horrible, basically, and that research bears out across the country for that. So certainly sex workers need access to healthcare services, and they need access to protections. They need access to police who will believe them and who will prosecute when they're assaulted or raped, etc. And they also need public health nurses who will perform rape kits without a smirky look on their faces that does a kind of blame the victim process. They need all of that stuff, but framing sex work initiatives in the context of public health, I think it sort of takes us back significantly historically to a place where often, and I talked about this in a previous presentation, but sex workers were framed as disease-ridden and in need of testing because the British government in particular didn't want to try to make all of their troops get tested. So they figured test the women, they won't push back as much. But there was a huge pushback in Victorian England and then in the Canadian context about that as well.
I would like to see the guys. I would like to see all the men who have to approach this sites have to be.
They need to bring in a clean slate.
Right, yeah. So for me, it would be the Johns, because the research for the last 30 years has definitely said that men are willing to pay more every time, all the time. Like 73% of men are willing to pay more to have sex without condoms with exploited or sex trade women who are having sex. Sometimes, with a lot of men a day.
Valerie Scott, one of the applicants in the Bedford case, had said that she worked at a place let's say in the States, in Nevada perhaps, at a brothel where she was required to go and pay a doctor at that brothel to perform a health check. She had a certificate saying she was clean, and every man who came in the door then wanted to go bareback.
The other thing I would say is that the study that we did 10 years ago on girls involved in prostitution said that all anybody ever cared about in terms of their health needs was whether or not they were disease-free and did they know how to engage in safe sex. And the girls said, we know how to engage in safe sex. We don't need that question asked all the time. Our health need is food and shelter, and nobody ever asks us what we're eating, where we're getting our food from, do we have a roof over our head, and is there a place we can take a bath? So I think if we do want to look at the health needs of people involved in sex trade, the health need is not with disease transmission, it's taking care of basic needs.
I just worry about an optionless analysis. I mean, what you're saying is we've just got to decide who we're going to punish.
No, I'm saying we don't want to punish.
No, I mean, as long as you're using the criminal law, you're in a punitive model. How do we extricate ourselves? I haven't really, maybe I'm not hearing well.
But at Deloitte, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. We could have the same response to Bedford as we had to Morgenthaler, which is nothing.
Yes, exactly.
And what's wrong with that?
Oh,
And that's basically what I'm advocating.
Yeah.
I'm advocating decriminalization.
Sure.
The people that I work with advocate that. They want those laws struck down, and there are a couple of other segments of the criminal code that would probably be challenged if the conservatives leave this alone. The fact of the matter is the conservatives aren't going to leave this alone.
Fair enough.
One last question.
Just in sort of reading about the Nordic model, there was a report that was commissioned by, I believe it was the Swedish government in maybe 2004.
By who, sir?
I think it was the Swedish government. And a couple of the findings that they found was that under the Nordic model, prostitution didn't decrease necessarily, but the proportion of dangerous Johns increased. But they also found that there was this interesting effect where women posing, or anyone posing as a sex worker, would do so under false pretenses to rob people. And then the issue is, well, are the victims of these robberies actually going to press charges or go to the police because they've sort of been soliciting sex, which is where the criminal provision kind of kicks in. So I'm just sort of wondering if, under the reasoning in the Bedford decision, would that kind of ancillary effect provide someone with standing to sort of challenge the constitutionality of the Swedish model in Canada?
That's a great exam question, and I really answered. I mean, I can see how people can twist, laws, but I mean, that's potential now for someone to, even with just stigma attached to it, not criminal code charges, so I don't know the answer, sorry.
Really interesting. Some of the other stats we have out of Sweden as well, initially the Swedish government was claiming that prostitution had decreased significantly, but the thing is, the law, when did they put the law, which is around the time that the internet was really taking off. So what we also see is an significant increase in the amount of prostitution that was taking place on the internet, and less than on the street at the same time. So what we saw initially was, there was a decrease in visible, like on the street prostitution initially, and then everything sort of leveled off. There was a huge increase in the number of people who were online, but everybody in the world was going online more. Well, not everybody.
It's also just impossible to know prevalence. You know, it's really difficult. I mean, unless you take, you know, something like the Canadian, whatever it's called, the general survey, you know, when you survey randomly 1,000 people in Canada. Here, my social science methodology is weak, but we don't have studies where we, you know, phone 1,000 men and ask how many have engaged in prostitution, you know, how many purchase sex, you know, when the conditions under which they purchase sex. We just don't have those kind of studies. So we don't know how many, what, you know, we couldn't actually know if prostitution went up or went down after the law was passed. We would have anecdotal observations about it, but it would be really hard to get into solid data, especially if there's no control from before. We don't have the data from before. How can you say it went down? We don't know what was up.
I think the flawed methodology in the Swedish government's report, right, is they were claiming things that could not be proven scientifically. And, you know, we've seen the trend since, you know, early 2002 where everything is going online. If we pulled up back pages right now, we could probably find 60 ads that went on from midnight. I couldn't find 60 people working on the street right now if my life depended on it. But, you know, 10, 15 years ago, you could have found 60 people working on the street easily. You know, we are seeing a trend again. And the internet is so hard to track what goes on there. You know, it's so wide open.
And there's so much research that could be done. So, for example, in Halifax, there's almost no street solicitation. It's all off-street. Where in Winnipeg, there's lots of street solicitation. What are the reasons for that? Is there something done differently in Halifax? Because street solicitation is the most dangerous work, right? So why is it different in Halifax than it is here? Is there a lesson that they could learn from Halifax? So there's research that could be done if there was interest in money to do it.
There is all kinds of really interesting research being done by the BC Center for Excellence in HIV/AIDS research. There were two projects headed by Kate Shannon. The first one was Project MACA. And that involves a lot of partnerships with community and police. That project is done, MACA is M-A-K-A. They have a huge report available online, and there are a number of academic articles as well. There's also the next phase in that project for which they've gotten funding is Project Aisha. It's I-E-S-H-A. There are acronyms. I don't know what the acronyms stand for right now. But really what we're looking at is a very interesting model that reflects or echoes some of the stuff that Jamie Blanchard is doing, actually. A kind of mapping to see where sex work is happening, partnering with sex worker communities to provide training for researchers and for police, and partnering with police to try to develop ways to minimize harms to community as well as to protect people against violence. And then we get a number of cooperative brothels that are unofficially opened, and they won't say where they are, but it all with the intention of providing for healthcare and protections and exit if people want exit, and safe working conditions if people want safe working conditions, and everybody wants safe working conditions.
Okay, I think we'll stop there. This is 4 o'clock, but we'll hang around if anybody has questions that they want to ask us. Thanks very much for coming.